Okay, thank you for coming. I'm sorry Jeffrey won't be with us today, but I'm sure he'll watch the video with interest. Our speaker today is Alexander Field from Santa Clara University in California. He's been publishing for almost 50 years on economic history, economic theory, and spreading into the other social sciences. Some of you may be familiar with his 2004 book, his altruistically inclined, the behavioral sciences, evolutionary theory, and the origins of reciprocity, which won a Social Science National Book Award. Anyway, Professor Field's topic for us today is, do you believe in magic? How evolutionary influences warped our understanding of U.S. armaments production between 1941 and 1945. So I'll ask you to turn off your pictures and your mic. And when it's finished, when Professor Field has finished his talk, please use the finger, the thumb sign for asking questions and making comments, okay? So it's all yours, Professor Field.
Well, thank you, Marion, and I want to thank Jeff for inviting me to give this lecture, and for Brian for dealing with the dry run and so on, and for everybody who's here today and everybody who may be watching this, asynchronously later. So this is an economic history story about a new interpretation of the economic effects of U.S. war mobilization for the Second World War. It is also an epistemological inquiry, an attempt to understand how it was possible for a conventional wisdom to which so many have adhered, and which I think is mistaken, could have become so firmly entrenched in the minds of many, including me in the past, and including many other scholars with strong commitments to objectivity and scientific principles of inquiry, and with, in principle, access to the same sources as I have been examining. I'm going to proceed in several steps today. I'll talk first about the main argument of my new book, which I think is novel, correct, and important. Second, I'll provide representative illustrations of what I describe as received wisdom in order to dispose of concerns that the views against which I argue represent a straw man. I will not, however, lay out all the evidence that my new view is basically right. For that, I recommend reading the book or a recently published article in the Economic History Review, which lays out and develops the central empirical argument. Rather, for the sake of this presentation, I'll ask you to stipulate that the argument is basically right, and that will provide the setup for what I want to focus on here with this audience, which is how I think evolutionary influences on our cognition and psychology have helped badly flawed interpretations and conclusions to entrench themselves deep within what we believe we know. So let me try to share my screen here just a moment. Okay, so there's there's a picture here. You have a picture on the left of the cover of the book that I'm describing. In the right panel, the recent article in the Economic History Review. So I'm going to begin with a summary of the key argument of the new book. Conventional wisdom regarding the effects of U.S. mobilization for the Second World War revolves around two key propositions. First, that war spending and monetary accommodation rapidly closed the negative output gap still prevailing in 1941 and thus ended the Depression. And second, that experience producing military durables led to dramatic reductions in unit costs, and that these learning effects persisted into the post-war period, establishing the supply foundations for what's viewed as the golden age of U.S. economic growth, 1948 to 73. As I said, in the recently published book by Yale and in this open access article in the EHR, I've challenged the second of these narratives, showing that productivity within U.S. manufacturing in fact fell sharply between 1941 and 1945, leaving labor productivity in 1948 roughly where it had been in 1941, and total factor productivity, output divided by a combined measure of labor and capital service input, substantially below its pre-war level. This analysis builds on earlier work in the American Economic Review article from 2003 and my 2011 book from Yale, A Great Leap Forward, 1930s Depression and U.S. Economic Growth, which suggested that scientific, technological, and organizational advances across the Depression years greatly increased the country's potential output, and thus consequently that the supply side foundations for the US Golden Age and its worldwide dominance in the immediate post-war period were, for the most part, already in place in 1941. Now, this body of research does not question the data underlying the various studies documenting learning by doing in the manufacturing sector as a consequence of military production. What you see here is a sort of plots of the unit costs as a function of accumulated output. Actually, it's a function of time here, but they're strongly correlated. It argues, however, that the experience effects resulting improvements in manufacturing productivity, which we see here, only partly compensated for the depression in those metrics resulting from the sudden, radical, and ultimately temporary changes in the product mix. The US system of mass production relies for the most part on single or special purpose machine tools. When the goods produced change, as in the annual model changes in the automobile industry, the plants shut down. Old tools, jigs, and frames are removed and scrapped, and new ones are installed. During periods of transition, both output and productivity drop to very low levels. It then takes time for both workers and managers to become proficient in making or assembling the new goods. The main cause of the sharp drop in productivity, between 1941 and 1942 was the transition from making goods in which manufacturers had a great deal of experience to those in which they had little. The wartime changes in product mix were far more extensive than those associated with the transition from one model year in the automobile industry to another. During the second full year of the war, 1943, manufacturing productivity recovered, but only partially as the result of learning. Military production peaked in the fourth quarter and then plateaued for the remainder of the conflict, with output per unit input resuming a sharp downward trajectory in 1944 and 1945 as the result of secondary product mix effects and the emergence of nationwide labor shortage, both of which aggravated production intermittency. These negative movements were reinforced in 1945 by reversion to a largely pre-war product mix following the sudden end of the Pacific War in August. As a result of demobilization, the US stopped making most of the goods whose cumulative production had given rise to the learning. Now, the effects of these product mix changes would have been serious in terms of their impact on manufacturing productivity, even had there been no additional disruptions. But there were additional disruptions. Aside from Pearl Harbor, US territory did not suffer from direct attack by enemy forces during the war. A Japanese submarine ineffectively shelled oil storage tanks near Santa Barbara in 1942, and in 1945, 6 people were killed in Oregon by an incendiary bomb carried by balloon on air currents from Japan. The effects on the economy of both incidents were negligible. Nevertheless, actions by both Germany and Japan seriously disrupted the US economy through means other than simply forcing the change in the product mix. The Germans did so via U-boat predation, shutting down the tanker pipeline that brought petroleum and petroleum products from East Texas and Louisiana to the eastern seaboard. The Japanese did so by overrunning Singapore in February 1942 and then rapidly taking control of almost all Southeast Asian sources of natural rubber. This deprived the United States of 97% of its supply of the one strategic material in which it had effectively no domestic sourcing. So this is a picture of the Japanese co-prosperity sphere at its greatest extent. You can see its control over Malaya, the Malayan Peninsula, as well as the Dutch East Indies. This is a picture of a plant that might have produced latex that could have provided the United States with another source of domestically grown rubber. Here is a picture just in terms of the German disruption of tankers sinkage locations in the first 6 months of 1942. Here's some more pictures of these oil tankers and petroleum tankers being sunk. Here, just an overview of my calculations of manufacturing productivity, growth rate of manufacturing productivity in different time periods. You can see the 1941-1948 period standing out with a strong negative growth rate. Negative growth rate is even stronger between 41 and 45. If you want more details on the calculations, I recommend either the book, chapter 2, or the EHR article. This just shows some year over year percentage changes in both labor productivity and total factor productivity in U.S. manufacturing. You can see the very strong shock in 1942, some recovery in 43, and then it's off to the races again in 44 and 45. Here is a plot of labor and total factor productivity in U.S. manufacturing. The first part of the graph essentially documents what I was talking about in that earlier book, that 2011 book, namely the strong growth over the Depression years, particularly after 1933, going up to the start of the war, the decline during the 4 years of the war, and then some partial recovery afterwards. So just to summarize, I'm going to borrow here from Robert Waple's review of my book in Choice, which he did an excellent job of summarizing the main argument. And basically what I've tried to do here is to debunk the idea that US economic performance during World War II is miraculous and spurred long-term economic growth. The main emphasis, as I've just suggested, is that total factor productivity within manufacturing declined at 1.4% per year between 41 and 48, that the learning by doing in certain industries could not overcome or compensate for the severe transition problems, disruptions, input hoarding, and shortages, that efficiency was not prioritized, haste made waste, and the war effort demonstrated the massive difficulties of a centrally planned economies. So anyway, he talks about the work I did on rubber and on oil, and the extent to which much of the skill and equipment that was accumulated during the war was obsolete by the end, that I see the war as a detour, not as a springboard to future growth. It's up to readers such as you to decide whether his summary judgment at the end is in fact warranted. Okay. Now, as I said earlier, I'll come back to that book, which Marianne both mentioned. But before I get to that, I'm going to ask you to stipulate that the new view I propose is in fact correct. I do need to dispose of the concern, however, that my argument lacks novelty, that this view is in fact quite different from what has been the received wisdom on these matters. Now, I may not have to convince you because these ideas, these claims may seem very shocking to you. But anyway, I'm going to lay that out and just provide a few examples of the extent to which this is very much at variance with what's the received or conventional wisdom, and in fact, what I took as the wisdom before I kind of got deep into this research. For example, the economic journalist William Grider, in his 1987 book about the Fed, Secrets of the Temple, enthusiastically endorsed the conventional wisdom about the long-term effects of mobilization. For America, quote, the economic consequences of World War II were extraordinarily bountiful. He described how the government force-fed the rapid development of new productive facilities across many industrial sectors that would become the basic industries of America's post-war prosperity, thus, quote, laying the groundwork for an abundant future. It was, he suggested, little short of an industrial revolution. Implication, long-term consequences of this. In the title of his 2006 book, Is War Necessary for Economic Growth?, the economist Vernon Rutten posed a provocative question that he then answered affirmatively. It is difficult to overemphasize the importance of the historical role that military procurement has played in the process of technology development. Without war, he suggested, the R&D spending necessary to develop new technologies would simply not be forthcoming. Now, recent treatments by historians of the economic consequences of the Second World War reflect a similar robustness of the thesis as it applies to that conflict. In Warfare State, 2011, James Sparrow wrote that, quote, the war brought opportunities for, quote, creative destruction, unquote, on a scale that is yet to be matched. Now, the reference was not to artful bombing, but rather to an alleged Schumpeterian dynamic in which wartime innovation devalued older assets and businesses and sometimes led to their demise. Maury Klein, in A Call to Arms, Mobilizing America for World War II, focused less on the standard learning by doing narratives, the Liberty ships, the B-24s, and instead on new products, enumerating a range of innovations, he argued, originated in the war and benefited the post-war economy. jet planes, radar, magnetic tape recording, early computers, a host of electronic innovations. And in Freedom's Forge, How American Business Prosperity Produced Victory in World War II, Arthur Herman gave as much credit as he could to America's business leaders, not labor and certainly not government, for the success of American war mobilization, arguing that captains of industry both transformed the American military and, quote, laid the foundation for a post-war prosperity that it would stand across 3 decades into the 1970s and fuel the economic growth of the planet. Now, we may or may not accept Herman's grant of heroic status to Americans, captains of industry, but in each of these instances, we see endorsements of the idea that there were persisting supply effects of great consequence and that these resulted from the experience of war production, either generally or with specific reference to World War II. The view with economists on these matters have been buttressed by a series of widely accepted stylized facts about wartime productivity growth. Jeremy Atek and Fred Bateman, in their essay on manufacturing in the 5-volume Historical Statistics of the United States, Millennial Edition, write that during the war, the manufacturing sector attained new heights in output and productivity. I agree about output. I respectfully disagree about productivity. And they go on to say, America emerged from World War II as the world's strongest economy and the leading producer of manufactured goods. In contrast, I argue that America's productivity advantage over the rest of the world predates its participation in the war and was by 1948 strengthened not by the experience of war production, but by the devastation experienced by US manufacturing competitors. Okay. In 1986, William Baumol, based on his readings of Angus Madison's data, took World War II's contribution to higher labor productivity growth during and after the war as a given. It is noteworthy that the duration and amplitude of the great leap above historical U.S. productivity growth in the war and early post-war years were just about as great as the previous shortfalls during the Great Depression. And in his influential 2016 book, Robert Gordon restated the thesis insofar as it applied to the Second World War and used macroeconomic data on TFP growth to bolster his narrative. Now, among those who've looked at the data, and I include Mo Abramovitz, Bob Solo, John Kendrick, Paul David, Gavin Wright, Bob Gordon, and myself, there is consensus that in the United States, the second quarter of the 20th century witnessed high total factor productivity growth. My contribution over the last quarter century has been to show that this was driven by exceptionally high TFP growth across the Depression years between 1929 and 1941, and that from this standpoint, the war years and more generally 1941 to 48 were a detour. I don't dispute that at 1948, at the start of the Golden Age, the US did stand astride the world economy like a colossus. But I argue that this was in spite of the war, not because of it, that most of this advantage was already in place in 1941 and was exaggerated by wartime disruption and destruction in other countries. Now, I hope that these references established beyond a reasonable doubt that received wisdom about the supply side of the effects at war are at substantial variance with the argument that I have been advancing. And as I noted before, in order to proceed with our discussion, I'm asking everyone listening to stipulate that what I've laid out is correct, and moreover, that it truly is revisionist. It is not or has not been the prevailing narrative. And this leads me to the core of my discussion today, a question that has intrigued me as I was working on this research and writing of this book, and as I now look back on the experience. That is why so many people, not just members of the lay public, coalesced around a narrative that I now find so problematic. The answer I proposed is based on my appreciation of the role that evolutionary forces have played in influencing not just our physiology and biology, but also our cognition and our psychology. These interests were reflected in my 2001 book, Altruistically Inclined, which Marianne mentioned in the introduction, published by Michigan actually in 2001. My talk today, though motivated by research into the economic history of the war and its consequence, is principally concerned with how a faulty conventional wisdom became so firmly entrenched, not just in popular culture, but among writers and social scientists who presumably pride themselves on their objectivity. My answer is principally that we are human. There are several relevant aspects of this. First, our cognitive bandwidth is limited. And that means we can't zero base all of our views about the world every morning. Second, no matter how hard we struggle against it, we are prone to be influenced by myths, magical thinking, and emotional appeals because we have been evolutionarily selected to have these dispositions. What has surprised me in this instance is how powerfully this can and has affected those strongly committed in their scientific work not to be influenced by these appeals. I'll start with the first observation, that our cognitive bandwidth is limited. We can't zero base all our beliefs every day. And this necessitates a certain amount of argument from authority. This is necessary in order to get through life. We don't lightly dispute or question views that have been widely propounded and accepted by a broad range of those with apparently specialized knowledge of the issues and questions. But this leaves open the question of how those views became established in the first place among those experts. A central factor here, in my view, is that the United States and its allies were victorious in the Second World War. Unconditional surrender from Germany and Japan. And this experience gave rise to what I call a celebratory imperative, which has had the effect of weakening defenses, guardrails against emotional appeals, and made us prone to suspending critical judgment about many war-related phenomena, including the record of mobilization and war production. A celebratory imperative increases our receptivity to magical thinking. And once these false narratives become widely accepted, they can become self-perpetuating, as the quote, wisdom, unquote, of those who have gone before is repeated, which further raises the barrier faced by non-conforming evidence to overturn them. From a Bayesian perspective, the barriers to rejection become stronger and stronger because prior beliefs become stronger and stronger. What we are faced with is a collision of Baconian scientific principles to which we may express adherence and human behavioral and cognitive predispositions. All of us committed to academic research strive to overcome these dispositions, try to be objective in how we resort to explanations, and try not to appeal to myths, miracles, or magical thinking. If there are two words that I would like to have expunged from treatments of the US experience in the Second World War, they are miracle and miraculous. To appear to miracles or use the word miraculous is literally to appeal to the supernatural, to say that the results are so much beyond what could reasonably expected given the facts on the ground that they could only have been achieved as the result of divine intervention. We aspire to this, but we are human and our goal is never quite attained. The spirit may be willing, but the flesh, at least part of the wet stuff that resides in our skulls, is weak. The basic idea here, of course, goes back at least to Thomas Kuhn. Now, the literature documenting our human propensities for magical thinking and the construction and acceptance of myths is extensive and familiar to most in this audience. Suffice it to say that the continued appeal of religion exploits these propensities, which may in fact have been evolutionarily adaptive. The willingness of millions of humans to accept claims and narratives that could not possibly be true by any scientifically objective standard is testimony to the power and reach of these inclinations. Frankly, every time we vote or make small dollar donations to a candidate, arguing to ourselves that this could make a difference, we surrender to a bit of magical thinking. And I should make it clear, parenthetically, that I do vote, just that I believe that I need to establish a non-consequential rationale and justification for doing so. Now, it may well be that large-scale cooperation indeed depends on the promulgation and widespread acceptance of myths. Trade requires trust. Noah Harari and Sapiens argued that the ability to create an imagined reality out of words enabled large numbers of strangers to cooperate effectively. Myths and magical thinking go together. Humans appeal to be wired to experience positive language when we surrender to magical thinking. Our evolutionary program makes us feel good when we do so. Dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins are released and flood the brain. I suggest that these have the power from a scientific perspective to cloud our thinking. All of this said, human propensities to appeal to miracles or magical thinking may very well have been evolutionary advantageous, fostering cooperation. But these same propensities can be the enemy of scientific progress. I will now make what I consider an important side point, not because I necessarily expect everyone to accept this, but because I devoted a large part of my 2001 book to it. The point is about the nature of evolutionary models and mechanisms we use to explain the emergence of these biological and behavioral propensities I am highlighting. In evolutionary game theory, we have multiple explanations about how cooperative behavior is sustained, sometimes by appeal to frequency-dependent selection. But that is a challenge that differs from explaining how propensities to cooperate, for example, in One-Shot Prisoner's Dilemma, played with those who are not closely related, how these can emerge. Since the degree of shared genes falls off very rapidly, Dawkins and the selfish gene may suffice to explain parental sacrifice for children, but is insufficient to explain the emergence of cooperative propensities in groups as small as 50. Anything that extends beyond the immediate family, first cousins share just an eighth of their genetic makeup, and the overlap falls off rapidly with greater genealogical distance. So that in this book, I argued, building on the work of George Price, Elliot Sober, David Sloan Wilson, and others, that the emergence of such propensities, not necessarily how they were sustained, required group level selection, that it is incoherent to attribute it to the operation of individual selection alone. I still believe that. But in order to narrow and not derail the focus of our discussion today, I won't ask you to sign on and endorse what still appears to remain the third rail of evolutionary biology, even a quarter century after I did the research for and wrote that book. I am, however, asking you to consider the obstacles thrown up against correct belief by the human behavioral and cognitive propensities that support cooperation, however they may have emerged. So coming back to the war, my argument is that the combination of the production of indisputably large quantities of military ordnance with the emotional release associated with victory fueled a suspension of critical facilities that resulted in a reflexive lionization of all aspects of the war effort, along with fueling such memes as the quote, good war and quote, the greatest generation. This took place and has taken place even among those who are ostensibly committed to a disinterested analysis of reality. There is a secondary influence at work, however. The narratives took root not just because we are human, but because interested parties who understood the legacies of evolution on our cognition and our psychology and had a stake in solidifying certain views engaged in a disciplined, heavily resourced campaign to make sure those views were accepted. In particular, the view the U.S. business was engaged both during the thereafter, and particularly the fact that United States business was engaged both during the war and thereafter in a struggle over who could claim credit for the war production success. Before talking about those efforts, I want to zero in how easy it is for scholars under the influence of the celebratory imperative to suspend critical distance and surrender to feel-good narratives. Well, because they feel good. I'm going to refer to passages in the work of Robert Gordon, who you may have heard of, and George Terborg, who you probably haven't. And I want to dissect a short paragraph written by each of them and identify the precise point where carefully qualified thinking breaks down under the influence of propensities which we all share as human, and these scholars throw caution to the wind. So I'll start with Bob's book, 2016 book, bestseller, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. I read this all in draft. I have very little problems with everything except for chapter 16, in which he identified the decade of the 1940s as the period of most rapid total economy TFP growth, part of a generalized great leap that he situated to the second quarter of the century. Well, without getting too deep into the reads, in my view, he appropriated the term great leap from me, from my earlier book, but I did identify it. I identified it in my 2003 AER article and that book with the 1929-41 period. And in my 2022 book, if you're interested, I spend a considerable time explaining the apparent discrepancies between my and Bob's views of the 40s. Part of what he did was choose to measure between census years, thus violating a long-standing National Bureau tradition of trying to measure between business cycle peaks, or at least similar stages of the business cycle. Suffice it to say that I think he's wrong, or at best misleading, about the 40s, particularly in manufacturing, but I want to focus on the ways in which carefully qualified statements give rise, under the influence of the celebratory imperative, to unbridled and unqualified enthusiasm that may not be supported by the historical record. So in his restatement of the war benefits aggregate supply thesis as it applied to the Second World War, Gordon begins it by asserting that its, quote, most novel aspect was its assertion that World War II was perhaps, now I've bolded the word perhaps here, the most important contributor to the Great Leap, but it does essentially indicate that this is a qualified conclusion. As he developed his argument, however, he abandons that restraint and that hedging reflected in the initial inclusion of the word perhaps. And in fact, the case is overwhelming, he says. In fact, the case is overwhelming that for the economic rescue interpretation of World War II along every conceivable dimension. Okay. By which he meant that the rapid rise in US productivity during the second quarter of the 20th century. As he developed his argument, there is little doubt that Gordon intended every conceivable dimension to refer to aggregate supply as much as aggregate demands. In other words, Gordon endorsed the views that the war ended the Great Depression by giving the economy a very powerful aggregate demand shock, a view I accept, and also that the war resulted in a powerful aggregate supply shock, increasing potential output, a view I dispute and one which I think is wrong. We see here exactly the point in an author's account where the critical filters drop away, where one surrenders to myth and good feeling, where one ultimately decides to believe in magic. Indeed, I originally wanted to entitle my book, Do You Believe in Magic? The editors objected to that, although chapter 10 still has that title, because I wanted to focus a bright spotlight on how frequently the words miracle and miraculous appear in accounts of US mobilization. But I don't mean to single out Bob Gordon. His writing is an influential example, but he's far from alone. The tendency to discussions of the supply side effects of the war to move enthusiastically from qualified speculation to unqualified certainty was not new. It's beautifully illustrated in a short book criticizing Alvin Hansen's theory of secular stagnation, which was published originally in 1945. In this book, George Terburg included this aside. Incidentally, the march of invention has probably, note the qualification, been stepped up on balance by the impact of the war, which has in many cases telescoped into a few years what would otherwise be the product of decades. Note the qualification. He faced the post-war era, he says, with an unprecedented accumulation of new materials, new techniques, and new products that will create hundreds of new industries and revolutionize scores of old ones. The qualification drops away. And then finally, never in history have we had so huge a backlog of inventions awaiting practical application. Completely unqualified and unsupported assertion. This is okay. This passage evidences the same transition from qualified uncertainty, use of the word probably in the first sentence, to the expansive and confident certainty, quote, never in history, in the final two sentences. Both Gordon's and Terburg's transition represent leaps of faith. They are not evidence-based. Now, Gordon went on to argue that the economic rescue represented by production and productivity growth during the Second World War propelled TFP to a permanently higher level and was therefore largely responsible for setting the stage for the Golden Age, 1948 to 73. This is essentially the same position taken by Klein and Herman and the other authors I mentioned earlier. Gordon explained this logic. The most obvious reason why productivity remained high after the war is that technological change does not regress. People do not forget. Once progress is made, it is permanent. After the war, quote, as they struggled to fill orders that seemed almost infinite, they adopted all that they had learned about efficient production in the high pressure economy of World War II. He repeated the oft-cited examples of learning by doing in building airframes and Liberty ships, and then argued that the shipyard example can be generalized to the entire manufacturing sector, and that, quote, every part of the post-war manufacturing sector had been deeply involved in making military equipment or its components, probably true, almost just largely true, and that the lessons learned from the war translated into permanent efficiency gains after the war. And this is what I dispute. It might have been different if the United States had persisted into the future in making 100,000 piston-driven aircraft a year, but we didn't. So, to summarize again, my view is that the US manufacture of munitions during the war, on balance, owed little to advances in efficiency. Manufacturing productivity, in fact, fell dramatically between 1941 and 1945. Among other desiderata, speed of delivery was a much higher priority than efficiency, And throughout the war, the manufacturing sector was plagued by shortages, producer hoarding, and production intermittency. I think many of us have a view of U.S. factories during the war as operating three shifts, operating 24/7, 365 days a year. That's not the image. That's not the view that I pick up, having gone deeply into the sources. Okay, and that success, along with the reality of victory, the success in producing 300,000 aircraft and hundreds of thousands of other items of military ordnance, along with the reality of victory and unconditional surrender, has fueled a celebratory imperative which is common in countries that aspire to be or have been victorious in war. It afflicts journalists, historians, and many others, and it spills over into a sense of obligation to paint all aspects of a nation's efforts in a rose-colored light, glossing over or ignoring inconvenient features. It easily metastasizes into hosannas of praise, crowding out critical analysis. Emerging out of natural human inclinations, it can be powerfully reinforced by those with a vested interest in establishing particular narratives. Now, I have only a few more minutes here, but I'll just spend a little bit of time on this. Where did this economic miracle narrative emerge from? It emerged against the backdrop of a continuing contest over how to organize, characterize, and credit the production successes. The use of the word miracle to describe U.S. war mobilization took shape in 1942 in an address by Eugene Wilson, CEO of United Aircraft. Picking up on this theme, the Ford Motor Company ran advertisements describing production efforts as, quote, the greatest miracle of mass production the world has ever seen. Language echoed in the firm's PR film about its problem-plagued Willow Run plant and in much of the journalistic treatment of what was happening within the factory. President Roosevelt used similar words in his January 1943 State of the Union address, referring to, quote, the miracle of production. The spread of this language was in part the result of efforts led by the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to ensure that private enterprise got all or most of the credit for winning the war, even though most production took place in government-owned and government-built factories, and armies of government employees, both civilian and military, supervised and monitored what was taking place. Business was determined to reestablish and reassert a dominant status from which it had been, in its view, temporarily and unfairly dislodged during the New Deal. This narrative was reflected and reinforced in Francis Walton's The Miracle of World War II, How American Industry Made Victory Possible, published in 1956, and many other publications, including Arthur Herman's 2012 bestseller, which I've already referenced, Freedom's Forge, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. The reality is that even beyond the government-owned and government-operated Navy yards and Army arsenals and proving grounds, production took place largely within contractor-operated plants and facilities owned by the U.S. government, which by the end of the war accounted for approximately a fifth of U.S. manufacturing capacity. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. government employees, both military and non-military, negotiated contracts, assigned priorities, or eventually raw material allocations, audited books, inspected output, and in some cases, with the backing of arms, took over production facilities where labor or management recalcitrance threatened the war effort. Even after paying excess profit taxes, business did very well during the war. The campaign to ensure that private enterprise, not government or labor, got credit for the success of economic mobilization was relentless and disciplined, funded by some estimates to the tune of $500 million tax-deductible dollars a year. There was, it is true, minor concern within the National Association of Manufacturers about possibly offending the military if business tried to claim too much credit for victory. And business leaders were so focused on who should get credit for the production achievements that they eventually began expressing unease about references to, quote, miracles. Their concern was that such language did not adequately credit the contribution of the production experience gained in 150 years of free enterprise before the war, as the president of the National Association of Manufacturers put it in a speech in December 1943. Okay, well, we're coming to the end here, and so let me just try to bring this to a conclusion here. For the United States, saying it remains the reality that the experience of the Second World War looms largest among all wars in fueling the war benefits aggregate supply thesis. In 2007, Keith Crawford and Stuart Foster observed that the United States, quote, cannot escape the powerful hegemonic hold that World War II has on us. It is part of our everyday discourse, and its presence is visible all around us in ideological, political, and academic debates, as well as in myriad popular cultural relics, monuments, and memorabilia. And this is true even among those of us who are scholars or fancy ourselves immune to such influence. For economic historians and time series econometricians, the Second World War often remains a cipher, a series of years to be omitted from multiple regressions or otherwise passed over. But it continues to play an important role in the macroeconomic narrative of the 20th century, both in closing the output gap remaining in 1941 and in allegedly laying the groundwork on the supply side for post-war advance. In 1948, the United States stood astride the world, both militarily and economically, having endured 2 atomic bombings and the firebombing of Tokyo and most of its larger cities. Germany and much of Europe was in ruins. The Soviet Union had suffered some 20 million war-related deaths. England had sold off much of its remaining overseas economic empire to pay for military success. The United States appeared relatively unscathed, and it was easy to connect the country's success in producing hundreds of thousands of aircraft and other military hardware with the level of its potential output after the war. And the large productivity gap between the US and the rest of the world is evident. But my argument is that this connection is a mirage. For reflecting on the success of a public relations campaign in discouraging critical inquiry, Senator Claude Pepper, Florida Democrat, observed in a 1940 speech that we have almost enshrined the words free enterprise into a propagated by the National Association of Manufacturers into a national taboo beyond the search of inquiring minds. Behind that same year, the sociologist Robert Lind warned of what he viewed as business's most effective tactic, the selling of the private enterprise system on the theory that if you control public opinion, you have the government in your hand and labor behind the 8-ball. Now, in asking you to examine and perhaps discard deeply held views, I am asking what it means to embrace the miracle narrative and why we might be receptive to it. My answer is in part that we are human. It makes us feel good. In part that business spent hundreds of millions of tax-deductible dollars during the war and after it to cement an often misleading and at best woefully incomplete narrative that encouraged us to do so. And in part that many writers and influencers after the war embraced and reinforced this feel-good narrative, oblivious to or ignoring what management stipulated in post-war negotiations. What I refer to here is that throughout the war, business triumph emphasized a triumph of both production and productivity. After the war, we had one of the most severe periods of labor strife in the U.S. economy, and labor demanded catch-up wage increases to compensate for the productivity improvements which business had been trumpeting throughout the war. At that point, management said, "Oh no, actually we were wrong. Productivity has been declining." Now, I think that they were actually correct in their latter views. Okay, in thinking about the war, and I'm going to end here, no less than in understanding the political terrain of the second half of the 20th century and navigating that of the 21st, we must continue to be sensitive to the ways in which interested actors work and have worked, often with a deep understanding of human behavior and psychology, the use of language and techniques of persuasion to share narratives about the present and the past. So let me now stop the sharing here. Okay. Brian, that's I tried to stay within my allotted time. So if you want to, or Marion, you're going to be moderating what discussion we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Field, for a very interesting talk. We'll take questions and comments. People just use the hand signal, please. Brian, go ahead.
Yes, you do. That was great. I really, really enjoyed that. You had me enthralled. I suppose my question is that if we have this sort of biological evolutionary imperative to believe a great myth, as it were, if that's not simplifying too much. Can you, two-part question. First, can you think of any parallel examples, parallel to the, believing the great productivity leap, great productivity miracle? And the second part of the question would be, can you think of an antidote?
Okay, let me try to deal with the second one. I think it's just, again, we may have our strong intentions, but it is something if we're trying to do, academic work, historical work, social scientific work, I think it's something that we need to struggle with. Again, this goes back to the work of Thomas Kuhn, and so I don't want to be entirely relativist about it, but I think if we're aware of it, we may be more prepared to struggle with it. But it's always a conflict in terms of, as I say, you can't zero base everything. You go into a field, you have to read what essentially the received wisdom is, and you start from there. And that's just something we're going to have to struggle with. Now, in academic, I mean, certainly in terms of political discourse, the degree, one can think of many examples in which very large numbers of humans have have accepted myths, and we've also seen examples of interested parties who kind of have an understanding of these predispositions, exploiting them. One can think, for example, within the historiography of the United States, in which the degree to which the South, which lost the war, kind of was very successful in creating a series of myths about that war, and which were accepted by large numbers of people. Certainly within the United States right now, we see evidence of a third of the U.S. electorate having accepted the myth that the 2020 election was stolen. So I don't think we have to look very far to see how people, you have a Bayesian. If your Bayesian prior is 100%, it's very difficult to kind of have new information, kind of argue against that. But again, this discussion, which is I do get into in some detail in the last chapter of the book, and as I said, I thought about trying to tackle the book, title the book, do you believe in magic and so forth. It struck me partly because I was essentially rebelling against views that I had just accepted, basically, on the appeal of authority before. That's partly what I was trying to do here.
Okay, Sven? Sven, do you want to ask a question?
Sorry, I was muted. So a very interesting talk. I have a substantive question, and then a more. I'd like you to think a little bit about a second question. Substantively, I think the right would, and American capitalists would say, yeah, productivity went down precisely because the government was so involved in production, as you pointed out. In other words, volume went up, no doubt, but because of government involvement in the economy, the efficiency of the economy declined. That would be their argument, I'm pretty sure, if they took you seriously here. And I do. I'm just, how do you respond to that? But secondly, my recent book that I've been working on talks about the selling of capitalism after the war. There was a huge effort on the part of American capital to sell the free market. And I don't know if your book talks about that precisely, but it's a big part of the story. And I agree with you very much that we human beings are inclined to believe what others believe. That's my kind of question and comment.
Okay, as far as the first argument that the decline in efficiency was due to government involvement, I think it's, if I may say it, I think it's hogwash. And the examples I would give that, in 1927, after the 15 million Model T was constructed, Henry Ford decided that they had to develop a new car. It was the Model A. He shut down all Ford production facilities in the United States and in the world. Output essentially dropped to zero. And there's some people have argued that it had some role in the modest 1927 recession. Because why did it drop to zero? Because in order to produce a new car, again, using the American system of manufacturing, which uses specialized single-purpose tools, you have to pull out all of the machine tools, have designed and then install the new machine tools. And during that period, output falls to zero. My argument is that this product mix was many times more radical than what's involved in switching from the Model T to the Model A or in the annual model change. And so it's inevitable that you're going to have a very sharp disruption in output, and while managers and workers learn how to use the new equipment. So they tried initially to encourage businesses to make investments in these new manufacturing facilities by offering accelerated depreciation and other tax incentives. But business said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it because you're asking us to develop facilities, specialized facilities for producing products which have, frankly, a short product life. We don't expect this war to last forever, and we're going to be left at the end of it with facilities which essentially are not dual use and which we can't use. Therefore, business essentially said, you want this stuff, you're going to pay for it. You're going to get it built. If you want to bring us in as contractors, that's okay. But I just that's kind of my reaction to that. Now, as far as the selling of the business, I do talk about that in some detail in the last chapter of the book, and I think it's part of the whole story. But the other part of it is that there's fertile ground to be plowed here, and I think I just alluded to this really wonderful story about business's position on whether productivity improved during the war, because in their print advertisements, in their PR films and so on, during the war, it's always we got looking at the the learning curves and so on. Efficiency is going up by leaps and bounds along with output and so on. And then after the war, when labor comes in and says, okay, we want catch-up wage increases, the line changes, and essentially they're saying it's gone down. So I know I'll be happy to hear a response from you on that and so on. But I just I think the idea that you're going to there is an interesting article that I just read, a book by about the U.S. corporation by Richard Langlois, and he has unearthed an article by Abba Lerner, interesting economist who had argued, maybe provocatively, that we just should have relied on the price system entirely in the war. I just don't see how that could have worked in terms of being able to force this this change. And you're going to have anyway. I'll stop.
All right, should we move on? Jan William, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed that. In fact, there's three things that I could ask you, but I'll try to combine two of them, and then maybe there's time later for the other one. And the two that I want to combine are about the second part of your talk about the magical beliefs. And I will preface by saying that I was a bit surprised by your reaction to the first question by Brian, in the sense that you had been giving us arguments about what you called celebrative imperative.
Celebratory imperative, yes.
Celebratory imperative.
Yeah.
But then in response to Brian, you were also giving examples of the losing side doing the same thing. You were talking about the Civil War and the South having a narrative that also had a similar, a narrative of a similar type, and that people bought into. So to me, there seemed to be a bit of a conflict there between talking about celebration and the important role of that in stimulating this magical thinking, while on the losing side, there's also examples of this, like in the Civil War. And this brings me to my second point, which was my original question before I heard your answer to Brian. What really intrigues me, and I just want to venture a hypothesis that you may or may not like, so I would like your reaction. What intrigued me is that you are saying we are prone to this magical thinking, you also mentioned that in the book, the 2001 book that you refer to, that you take on board David Sloan Wilson and others about multi-level selection. And I was wondering if there could be something going on here of a sort of an interaction, that we are more prone to this sort of magical thinking in the context of intergroup conflicts. And it's just an hypothesis to venture that I think would be in line with what you're saying, and that I already thought of that before you answered Brian. But then when you answered Brian, you were also giving the losing side as an example. So the hypothesis that somehow maybe there's an interaction between we are prone to magical thinking, but we're especially prone in this between group conflict sort of context. Would that make any sense? And would that help explain your, what would ought to be difficult to explain your counter example? Well, for me, it was a counter example of the losing side doing the same thing.
I guess what I was trying to present is, I think there's two things. There's one kind of our human predispositions, and in terms of embracing this miracle, I don't really see this miracle narrative. I don't really. It's not like I'm saying this is some that our willingness to do this, and the fact that most people were embracing this, had some sinister or self-interested kind of motivation to it. But I am saying that said, part of the success of entrenching those narratives was also due to the people who kind of understood these predispositions and wanted to exploit them to establish a narrative that was particularly favorable to their economic interests. And that's where the issue that Sven had mentioned, which is this just enormous campaign after the war, the struggles in terms of Taft-Hartley and everything else, the struggles to essentially get rid of the government-owned naval yards. I mean, you could go on and talk about many of these examples exist. Now, in the case of the South, which I mentioned and so forth, yes, of course, it was the losing side that was trying to kind of rewrite history, but that was really the second dynamic that's playing out there. I mean, it's not that so I think we can kind of reconcile that by saying this is another example of people pushing a narrative which I think we can agree was false in terms of this picture of slavery and so on, that's how I would try to reconcile that. Now the other, it's that's a whole nother question in terms of whether we are more receptive to it when, of course, we have intergroup conflict. I don't really have a position on that, but I think that again, there's just this overwhelming sense of emotional release if you read the narratives at the end of the war, with the unconditional surrender of Germany, the unconditional surrender of Japan and so forth, the US standing astride the world economy like a colossus, which I don't dispute, and so forth, the American century, as Henry Luce said, and that's just this overwhelming sense of triumph and celebration, which is part of why I think so many people have been willing to go along with this narrative, as was I until I got deeply into the research. It seemed to make a lot of sense, particularly when you're looking at the output numbers, particularly when you're interested into listening to Stalin talking about how American factories won the war, etc.
Well, yeah, maybe to follow up on this idea that there might be a possible hypothesis that we're more prone to this thinking in the context of intergroup conflict. So the way you tell the story is in two steps, as it were. First, there's a celebration at the end of the war, and then that gets co-opted by private interests. So private enterprise co-opts the story and turns it their way. But the second part of the story could still also be interpreted in that sense, in the sense that, Japan and Germany had been beaten, but the new enemy was Russia. So again, there might be more of a receptivity to the story that people were trying to sell, because now there's this new enemy, which of course is the socialist communist state. So it might still, I don't know, maybe I'm looking for too many patterns here, but yeah.
Well, I think the experience of the United States after the Second World War in terms of how it's treated the vanquished parties was, perhaps unusual. We basically, the Marshall Plan helped to rebuild Germany, and the military occupation of Japan may have had its negatives, but it really wasn't, a draconian or
it gave them total quality management. I'm a management scholar, so it gave them total quality management. So yeah.
Okay, maybe I should keep out of this, but I'll throw in one question.
All right.
I was wondering if you had any ideas about the possible applicability of your argument today with the climate crisis inducing the production of battery-based cars, energy production, not using fossil fuels, solar, wind, and so on. Is there going to be a decline in productivity in those industries during the period of the greatest innovation?
I imagine that there would be. I think whenever you have a dramatic reorientation of the economy, there's going to be an initial sharp hit, and sometimes, sometimes you've got to be prepared to pay an efficiency price in order to get something done. So yeah, I think so. In the transition, that doesn't mean in the long run you're not better off. I mean, again, that's what I was trying to say about all of this learning producing Liberty ships. We produced over 2,000 of these dumpy freighters. They were built cheaply. 100 of them broke apart, by themselves because the welds were so poor. But they didn't really care because they figured they'd be torpedoed or gone anyway in a little while. But we're not going to. The United States did not persist in building, thousands of these vessels after the war. Or again, we produced 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945. Wow. That's a feat that had never been done before and will never be done again. But after the war, we did not mass produce either military products or civilian products. The closest we came in terms of something with a producing over 5 or 10,000 units was the Boeing 737, but that took place over decades rather than taking place over a couple of years, so that the learning is not necessarily applicable after the war because we stopped making most of the goods whose production had given rise to that learning.
So is the implication of that in this case today, that will not be the case? We'll go on producing electric cars and so on. So.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, some of you might be more specialists, on the electric car transition and so on. My sense is that these, there's obviously a lot of learning in developing, better batteries and so on in the first place. But my understanding is that actually the production of these vehicles is the vehicles themselves are simpler and are less prone to mechanical malfunction than gas powered vehicles. So there could be some efficiency gains there.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to throw in one more question or comment? Going once, going twice.
I've got another one.
Okay, good.
Maybe
go ahead, yeah.
But much more prosaic than my previous one, and it sort of built on where the discussion was going just now. You mentioned creative destruction, so Schumpeterian ideas, right. And you seem to do so sort of disparagingly a little bit, but I was wondering how I should understand your interpretation of the data there. So what I thought I understood you said was that the innovations that other people sort of linked to the Second World War, like jet propulsion, radar, and there's a handful of them, that they didn't play a role at all, that it was all the total factor productivity that had sort of already built up before 1941. Then there was sort of the distraction, and then we're back on the trajectory up until 41, from 48 onwards. So that would mean maybe that there has been some creative destruction in the Great Recession. That's then that create that. So I'm looking for two things. I'm looking for the link between the creative destruction idea of Schumpeter and what you're seeing in the data. The way I've always understood Schumpeter is that, okay, there is something new, creative, but it destroys the old. So we first have a recession, but at the same time, yeah, there is something building. Is that consistent with your interpretation of the data before 41? Yes or no? And then second, what then do you see as the role of the radar, the jet propulsion in this cluster of technologies? Did that not play any role after the Second World War? Or is that just a role that we only see with the same sort of, yeah, if you will, lag? We only see that happening in the 60s, that these innovations actually lead to productivity increases.
Let me talk about jet propulsion, because I think, I mean, first of all, just to be absolutely clear, unlike the German case, there was not a single US military aircraft during the war that relied on jet propulsion. Number two, I think there is indeed evidence that continued progress on jet propulsion continued during the war, often from smaller companies. And I think in cases such as that, one has to really posit a counterfactual, in terms of one has to ask, what would have been the trajectory of advance in jet propulsion in the advance of the war. And I say this coming back to the earlier book, which emphasizes this surprising finding that behind the backdrop of double-digit unemployment between 1929 and 1941, there was an enormous upsurge of research and development spending, big increase in the number of engineers and scientists employed in the United States, remarkable progress in chemical engineering, aeronautics, and a whole bunch of other kind of new industries and so on. And so in the case of jet propulsion, I don't think that I think, yes, that continued advance during the war did contribute, both in terms of military aircraft and commercial aircraft, to what we produced after the war. Was it the consequence of learning as a result of mobilization for the war? I'm saying largely not, because we were not producing jet aircraft. Essentially, the war involved an attempt, in my view, to apply technologies and organizational principles which had been developed during the 20s and particularly in the 1930s in mass producing automobiles, refrigerators, radios, and so on, applying those skills to a new set of products which were produced only temporarily. And that's essentially the basis of my argument that this was a detour. Again, you have a strong trajectory of productivity advance, surprisingly, even though there's a lot of unemployment persisting up until 1941, and that trajectory is disrupted by this sudden, radical, and ultimately temporary change in the product mix. Of course, there's going to be areas such as jet propulsion and radar and computers, and in all of these instances, one does, however, have to ask, how much of this progress was due to the kind of experience of war production, and how much took place during the war in spite of it. So I'm not going to, certainly some of that was those are continued trajectories. You take something like television. I mean, most of the kind of design work, Philo T. Farnsworth, that was funded by venture capital during the 1930s. Television commercial broadcast in the States introduced at the 1939 World's Fair. It's basically the widespread diffusion of TV, however, is delayed until 47, basically, after the war, that essentially the facilities were shut down to produce tubes for radar scopes and so on, rather than TV. And as far as the Schumpeterian, kind of the idea of creative destruction, again, this is assuming that Schumpeter's view about the kind of dynamic capabilities of capitalism, I think, is based on presuming an environment in which you do not have the government kind of taking over close to half the purchasing in the United States with the objective of pursuing the defeat of strong military adversaries and so forth. Is the result of essentially the development of new technologies which make obsolete old technologies, cause old firms to fail and new firms to develop. But here you essentially, yes, you do have a force-fed mandating a radical change in the product mix that the American business did not want to invest its own money in because they knew that the product life cycle was very short and they didn't want to get stuck with all this obsolete, an obsolete labor force, an obsolete set of equipment, and in some case obsolete factories after the war. So I'm not sure. So, and then again, that so much of what was learned during the war has essentially to be written off after the war because we no longer make this stuff. And then you could argue, well, maybe there were some spillovers more generally in terms of producing aircraft. But again, the production runs after the war were so much smaller in terms of the total number of units produced, much more higher unit costs that I'm somewhat skeptical about. I don't think I've fully answered your question, but those are some responses to your, where does Schumpeter fit into this? Where does jet propulsion fit into this?
Thank you.
Well, okay, if nobody else have ended, I give you enough time. You're
Thank
okay?
you. I could have gone on, but Brian said stop at 40 or 45 minutes. So
okay, all right. Well, we'll call it a day then. And thank you again very much for Professor Field for your very interesting talk. And I'm sure lots of people will be looking at the video.